So obviously our guest tonight that we're thrilled about is Lee Child. Not only one of the, I have been arguing one of the handful of greatest authors of the century, because the century's only 24 years old, so. But also somebody who over time has become a very dear friend and matters a great deal in my life. And he, in his way, has reciprocated that by allowing me to publish Safe Enough and Other Stories. Fantastic book, collection of short stories that have not been collected in book form before this. Many of them in obscure sources, so you probably have not read all of the stories in this book. Even if you're a devoted fan, there are some very small publications that have not been readily accessible, and so here they are all together at one time. Our first, I will let you speak in a minute. I know everybody really came to see me, so I'm hard to find. Just as an aside, the print run for this book is the biggest print run in the history of the Mysterious Press. Which next year celebrates its 50th anniversary.
Wow.
So this is the highlight of my career. Now I can just go home. But anyway, without more, I want to introduce my dear friend, the wonderful Lee Child, and we'll be talking a little bit to each other. Feel free to buy a book now and get it signed, or get your book now and pay for it later, but pay for it. Because I'm watching you. Lee, say hello.
Well, thank you. Hello, and thank you all for coming. And the easiest way to kick this off, the key to everything about this book is the dedication. So I'm gonna read the dedication, and it explains everything. To my longtime friend, Otto Penzler, whose idea this was. So I'm blaming him. I met Otto more than 25 years ago, and despite his personality defects, possibly because of my own matching defects, we became good friends. And Otto is sound in a lot of ways. His baseball instincts are good. His political opinions are terrible, but we get along. And the thing that I appreciate about Otto the most is that he is, as you might expect, super informed and intelligent about this genre. He has been doing this forever, since the middle of the 19th century. He knew Edgar Allan Poe. He knew Wilkie Collins. He's been there since the beginning.
He dedicated one of his books to me.
There you go. So that he knows his stuff. And the other thing about Otto is that he's a good judge. And he is always honest. If the book is shit, he will say so. And that is something you don't get much in publishing, because people, if you're successful, people want to say every idea you've ever had is fantastic, because they're just too nice to you. And I don't like that. I prefer people to be straightforward and upfront and say, yeah, this was good, that is bad. And
I can tell you, if I can interrupt for one moment, you make it sound like a good thing that I'm these things, but I am, and it's cost me dearly with people who were friends who said, would you please just read this and tell me honestly what you think. I just want the truth. They don't want the truth. It's nice.
Yeah, I can completely understand that. It must be difficult to get through that kind of thing, but personally I appreciate it. And that sort of worked in reverse for this book, in as much as Otto said to me, what about your short stories that are not about Reacher? Can we do a collection of those? And that threw me into a kind of weird mental panic because the way that I do these short stories, it does not feel like real life to me or my real job. The way I've been putting it is I've done a lot of radio interviews about this book for various people. And I say to the person interviewing me, you're a radio star. I'm sure you get asked to do emceeing at a charity auction or after dinner speaking or cutting the ribbon at a supermarket or something like that. And I'm sure you do it because you're a nice guy and I'm sure you do it very well. But you don't think of that as your main job. You would never say to somebody, oh, I'm a charity auctioneer. You say, no, I'm a radio presenter. That's your job. And that's how I feel. I'm a novelist. And I completely did not expect any involvement with short stories. I didn't know that the same people did both forms. I thought there was a specialist group of people that did the short stories and another group of people that did the long stories. I didn't know we were supposed to do both. And so my first novel came out and it was a genre hit. Within the tight confines of the mystery genre, the first novel did well, but it was completely invisible to the outside world. And then the second novel came along, and actually Otto was one of the very few people that really championed that second novel, and I appreciated that all the way back in 1998. A long time ago, and I remember him doing that, and that was sort of when I started thinking, this guy might be all right.
Yeah, he likes my books. He must be okay.
Yeah.
He must have great taste.
But around that time, I started getting requests for short stories, and the first one was a tactical thing in Britain because they hate it in Britain if you do what I did, which is you come to America and become successful. That is terrible. What you're supposed to do is starve in a garret in the East End of London and suffer for your art. And that was never my intention. My intention was minimum suffering and maximum enjoyment, which is why I came here. And so the first one I did is a tactical thing in Britain. Somebody asked for one, and I thought, well, if I supply a short story for free, by the way, you give them a short story, then they're going to stop the bitter criticism of me. And so I did that, and it was a Reacher story, which was actually very easy to do because it was part of my second novel that I'd had to cut out because it wasn't working. So I had this chunk, and I learned very early with writing, never ever delete anything. Just put it in a separate file, and sometime in the future it'll come in useful. So I kind of squashed it up together and made that into my first ever short story. And then this request came in thick and fast. And I liked doing Reacher short stories because the character was already there, the kind of structure, the grammar, the rhythms of it all, the character was formed. And there are always ideas that are intriguing for 5 minutes that you think, well, that's a great idea, but that won't last for a whole novel. So those little things are ideal for the Reacher short stories. And then at some point, I can't remember which was the first non-Reacher short story I ever did. And I found that so liberating in a way, because I could be somebody else. I could be, from a different time in history or a different country, different nationality. The character could be a failure. He could be weak and stupid. He didn't have to be, Superman like Reacher has to be. So I found it very, very liberating. But I had this strange thing going on in my head where for years and years I've worked in show business. In fact, got my first showbiz job when I was 17, which was a long time ago. And it was a great, ridiculous job. I was the assistant to an agent who booked working men's clubs, booked comedians and stuff like that, also booked strippers. And this guy was, had been in the business so long, he was bored with the strippers. So he said, you deal with the strippers. So that was my first show business job. And then I went to television. And what you learn very, very quickly is that if you're not getting any money for it, it's because nobody's watching it. There's a direct relationship in show business between the money you get and the size of your audience. And short stories, you don't get money for them. You get, most of them are donations to a charity volume or a cause you want to support, or especially writers' organizations. A lot of them fund themselves in that way. MWA, Mystery Writers of America, every year they do an anthology on a particular theme and it sells, and that supports the organization. ITW, International Thriller Writers, is supported entirely like that. There's no membership dues at all. Everything is supported by donated content. And so I was, you write these stories and maybe you get a couple $100 or something, just a nominal fee. But you're not making any money at all. And in my head, that translated, nobody is reading these. They are secret. They don't really exist. And that, again, was a second layer of liberation. I could do whatever I wanted because nobody was going to see it. And so it was so liberating. It was such a lot of fun. I mean, there were negative aspects to it too. I mean, there's one story in this book that I hope is not the first one you read, because it's, I'm amazed that I put it in. It's just ridiculous. It was for an ITW anthology about romance, basically, I think was the theme. So the story is called I Heard a Romantic Story. And I was high as a kite, and it is basically a 2,500 word paragraph that just rambles through. And I mean,
It's different.
I mean, we're not able to cobble them all together, dug them all out from all over the place. I didn't have them. I couldn't find them on my computer, but he found them somewhere. And I looked at that story again and I thought, what was I smoking? Although I got a pretty good idea of what I was smoking. But so yeah, they're liberating. They are not the same as I usually do. They are about different things. Actually, I think the first non-reacher one that I did was for an anthology that Karen Slaughter was putting together, and she had not thought of me at all in the first instance. And it was, the conceit of this anthology was that it was like a serial novel where each writer advanced the story a little ways across about 100 years. The idea was that there was this piece of Victorian jewelry, a charm bracelet, that would pass down the years from place to place and person to person down the years. And the anthology was more or less complete at this point. But one critical author dropped out, wouldn't do it. Had a dispute with Karen. Can you imagine?
No.
And so there was a gap. So she called me on the phone and said, I'm doing this anthology, blah, blah, blah. It's about a charm bracelet and so on and so forth. And because I was filling in a specific gap, it was incredibly tightly specified. She said, the charm bracelet has got to be found in a London police station about 40 years ago, and then it's got to end up inside a dead body's stomach. Because that was how it was left, and that was how it was picked up.
Wow. And you had to fill in.
I had to.
It wasn't, you weren't writing the last chapter, you were writing a chapter in the middle of the book somewhere.
It was the middle of the book, and everybody else had turned theirs in, so it was two fixed points. It was in a evidence lockup in a London police station, and then somehow it had to get into a corpse's stomach by the end of the story. And she was yakking away on the phone, and I was rehearsing ways to say no. Because I had said, well, you know, what's the deadline? And she said, well, basically Saturday. And so I was thinking, how do I say no to this? And I was about to say no, and then suddenly it popped into my head how it might happen, how I could do it. So I segued charmingly from about to say, get out of here, to, yeah, I can do that. And so I wrote it, and I found that tremendously liberating, because as you know, what I normally do is I'm a British person writing about America as if I was American. And I find that to be really useful from the writing point of view, because it means that, I mean, we're super familiar with America. 2 months ago was the 50th anniversary of me coming here for the very first time. And I emigrated in 1998. And part of the emigration, just in case Donald Trump is listening, I'm a legal immigrant. And in order to do that, you have to do an enormous amount of bureaucracy, including when you come to the port of entry for your physical entry to the country as a green card holder. You have to be holding in your hand a chest x-ray to prove that you don't have tuberculosis, as well as numerous other bureaucratic requirements, including you have to list every previous visit to the US so that they can check with police departments all over the place, are you a criminal? Are you an escaped serial killer or whatever? So I had to dig out my old passports, and I went through, and between 1974 and 1998, which is 24 years, I had exactly 100 visits.
Wow.
So I felt familiar with the country, but writing slightly from the outside means you focus on everything. Every word, every phrase, every sentence. You've got to be sure that you're doing it right, because this is not your natural vernacular necessarily, it's somebody else's. So you've got to concentrate on every single word. Whereas I feel that if I were writing about Britain, I would be constantly bouncing back and forth between what I already know and what I'm inventing. And the sort of complacency in what you already know might show through. So I'm really happy to do the Reacher books the way that I do them. But that particular short story for Karen Slaughter let me do a story set in London, which I've never done before. Never written anything about England or Britain. And it was fun to fall back into those British things that are worth writing about. You know, there's a lot of peculiarities in Britain that are good fun. And so I was happy to do that. And then I took that as my template. Just do whatever I wanted to do, wherever. I see Jonathan Sandplofer there. I've done lots of short stories for his anthologies, including one for the ACLU that I was able to, I wrote it from the point of view of a Black American who had emigrated to Paris and after World War II, in fact, stayed in Europe after World War II. And that liberation was great. I love that. It gives you a sense of freedom, total freedom. Not that I have any problem at all with writing the Reacher books. Absolutely love them. But the chance to do something different and something freer and more liberated, especially because nobody will ever see it.
No longer true. I hope.
Yeah, we hope that lots of people see them now. But that was the big hump I had to get over. I mean, because as Otto said, this is a serious publication with a big print on it, and hopefully it's going to do okay. I mean, in Britain, it's you know, it's an international publication, and it came out in Britain as well. And their response is much quicker in terms of assessing the sales. Here, typically, it's 10 days after publication before you have any clue there. It's less than a week. is eligible for the bestseller week immediately. And it got to number 5 this week in Britain.
Yeah,
So,
congratulations.
Well, it's, that's pretty bad, I think. But,
Not that you're spoiled.
yeah, exactly. But, it's, I hope lots of people are going to see them, but that's making me nervous because these were secret projects that nobody would ever know about. And now everybody's going to know about it.
Well, listen, you're very difficult to interview, by the way.
Yeah,
Speaking, yeah, monosyllabically. But I don't think you need to be afraid of it. I've read these stories. I read every one of these stories, and inevitably, like any anthology or any short story collection, they're not equally perfect. But there are a couple of stories here that, if I were editing the stories in the first place, I might have wanted to suggest a few changes. Like not one sentence or 2.5 pages, but some of the stories really soar. And I used the title Safe Enough because it sounded like a Lee Child title.
Yeah.
Doesn't it sound like a Jack Reacher book?
Yeah.
But also, as it happens, and I don't, I love, we all love all of our children equally. So I love all of the stories in this book, but Safe Enough is probably my favorite story, in addition to having the right title. It's a little longer than the others, and I'm so tempted to say something about it, but I won't, because I don't want to ruin it for you. But I guarantee you're going to love that story. You're going to love the book, but you're going to love all of it, and especially that story. Did you find it, any stories that were particularly difficult for you to write?
I think some of them, I learned to say to people that ask for them, there's a clue in the name, short story. It's going to be short, because to me, all of the stories in this book were written in one sitting, in one night. I never ever. Again, it's this thing in my head. Nobody's going to see them. You're not going to be paid for them. So why spend weeks doing them? So what I do is I need that impetus of the deadline being tomorrow. So I would always just wait until the night before the deadline and then sit down and write them from beginning to end, and then never alter a word and never look at them again. And that, Safe Enough, that was an NWA anthology called, I think it's called Till Death Do Us Part or something. It was 2004, it's 20 years old, that story. And Harlan Coben was the guest editor for that volume. And I remember him calling me and saying, will you do a short story for me? The theme is Till Death Do Us Part, or whatever the title was. And so I said, sure, and then totally forgot about it. And then I get this email from Holland saying, it's due tomorrow, where is it? And so I sat down and wrote the story, and I agree, that is a genuinely good story, because it's got more in it than just something weird going on and then the twist. It has some commentary going on. I was fascinated about the idea. It's about an electrician from the Bronx, a union guy, lives in the Bronx. I think early in the story it says the most grass he has ever seen is the outfield at Yankee Stadium. And there's a worker shortage up in Westchester. And so he goes up in a little minibus with a bunch of other tradespeople to this building project. These houses being built in Westchester. And it really becomes about the difference between a guy from the Bronx and a woman who lives in Westchester. That whole cultural clash. But I thought, yeah, it has something extra in it. I agree, that's a good one. And
you don't want to tell any more about the story at this point.
yeah.
Otherwise, we get it.
And some of the others were like that too. I mean, if I can even remember what they are.
Well, while you're looking, I could just say, one of the things that I found fascinating about the short stories is that we know Lee as the author of Jack Reacher, who is essentially Superman and the great heart of gold, no matter how many people he badly damages. Badly damages. But he's a heroic figure. I would say, I may be wrong, but I don't think I am. It's most of these stories here, they're protagonists and two bad guys, and they're a very different point of view to be writing about a bad guy and making him human, not necessarily a horrible human being. Because I remember several of the bad guys are not horrible human beings. So how did you find that, writing bad guys as your protagonist rather than a superhero?
Yeah, I mean, I really did enjoy that, looking at it from that point of view, because that's one of the worrying things about being a writer, that especially a series writer like me, one of the very standard questions that you get asked in softball interviews are, how much of you is in the main character? How much is Reacher really you? And you know, my stock answer to that is it's entirely autobiographical. Except that I toned down the violence to make it more believable.
Yeah.
But of course, the truth is that Reacher is obliged to win. You know, Reacher, he makes little mistakes along the way. He misses things. He's not 100% perfect in the investigation, but fundamentally, you know he's going to win. And you know that he's got a heart of gold, and you know that he's going to do the right thing, however brutal it may be. And so, yeah, the opportunity to write from the point of view of somebody setting out to do a bad thing. I mean, we've got murderers, we've got assassins, we've got all kinds of things here. Somebody setting out to do a bad thing and failing, you know, being inadequate to the task sometimes, which is a luxury I can't have with Richard, you know.
A couple of these characters are really stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, stupid.
Plus, yeah, some of them are really dumb, which
Yeah.
is also realistic, you know.
Yeah.
As you know, Otto and I do a thing, or we did in past years, where we all get together down in Florida for Yankee spring training. And it's hosted by Michael Connolly, who has attracted over the years a completely diverse bunch of characters who have somehow been associated with him or his books. And a lot of them are cops or federal people. And I know a lot of cops elsewhere, and I know a lot of cops in real life, because when you write in this genre, you end up meeting a lot of cops. And you talk to them, and real life crime is full of stupid people. And it is, generally speaking, so sort of awful and sordid and squalid that you couldn't put it in a book. The crime fiction genre is essentially very unrealistic as to real life. But with the short story, you can have some idiot, you can have somebody who's thoroughly bad, who screws up, or you can have somebody who thinks he's really good at this, you know, really good at this, and then he ends up getting an ice pick in his throat.
You have a couple of stories like that, where people think, you know, I'm the ace, I'm the best guy, and then they turn out not.
Exactly. So the common theme is just liberation, doing what I want to do, doing something that's different, avenues that have not been explored before. And I realized that the mental trick of imagining that nobody will ever see them was very useful to me. And now Otto's ruined that. People are seeing them. And
I hope a massive number of people get to read these stories and
I
prove you wrong, that they are, in fact, really worthwhile and that they're really good. So, just for just a moment, to switch subjects a little bit, I'm sure a lot of people would be interested to know, what's your opinion about the television series?
Well, about the television series, I feel I just love the fact that we're doing it instead of the Tom Cruise movies, which is, that is my honest opinion. And the movies themselves had fundamentally two problems. And I thought the first movie was much better than the second movie.
Yeah.
The first movie
Definitely.
the first movie stands up really well as a sort of B movie. I was on a plane. I did a kidney foundation thing in San Francisco, and flying back on the plane, the guy sitting next to me was watching that first Reacher movie on the screen. And
Do you know who you were?
no,
So it's just
Yeah.
coincidental?
totally coincidental.
Hilarious.
That is the thing about being a book writer, that you're completely anonymous. Another huge coincidence for me, I was on a plane to LA one time.
Not that anonymous.
I was on a plane and happened to be sitting next to Alec Baldwin. And in front of us was somebody watching 30 Rock, and their seatmate was reading my book. And
Nice.
they were all over Alec Baldwin, and nobody knew who I was. For an event like this, when my novels would come out, we would do a launch event. And the publicists, publishers are just lovely. If you're an author, they treat you so well. The publicist books a car to bring you to the event. And if it's in the city, I always say, no, I'll go on the subway, because I can be, here in 15 minutes as opposed to 45 minutes in a car. So I said, no, forget the car, I'll go on the subway. And it's publication week. And so I remember very clearly, and it was a really happy moment. I got on the subway, sat down, and opposite me were two people reading my new book, and over there was a third person reading my new book. With, as Otto says, they were literally like this.
Aww.
And I'm sitting right there. And they don't make any connection whatsoever. So I thought the first movie was fine. Second movie, much more average. But there were two problems. One was Tom Cruise, who actually was a lovely guy, terrific guy. And I've got nothing negative to say about Tom. He's a lovely man. It was a pleasure from beginning to end being associated with him. Nothing that you read about him is true. There was no bullshit anywhere. He's an incredibly hard worker. It was delightful to hang out with him. But the Reacher books depend on certain things. One is that if Reacher suddenly walked in that door right now, we'd all go,
Yeah.
just for a second. And there are lines in that first movie, like the cop detective goes to the motel and says, I'm looking for a guy who could kill somebody with one blow. And the clerk says, room 12. And there's Tom Cruise. It just doesn't quite work. But the other thing that was annoying about the movies is that they're very short. There's about 90 minutes worth of content in a movie. And if you look at everybody has a rough idea what a movie screenplay looks like physically. It's that particular font, Courier font, and it has particular margin sizes such that the page is mostly blank. It's mostly white space. And they do it that way because years and years ago, Warner Brothers found that if you format it in that way, then one page averages to 1 minute. And so a movie will have, 103, 110, 120 pages. But if you were to squash it all up so that the white space was gone, it's about 37 pages of content for a novel that was probably 10 times that long. So you're severely compromised with the running time. So moving to television, which was not available back when that movie deal was done. The Tom Cruise movie deal was done in 2005, and there was no streaming, binging television back then. It hadn't been invented. But it has now. And there is no way that any novelist would choose a feature film over streaming television because of the running time. You know, instead of 90 minutes, you've got 8, 10, 12 hours to tell the story, which means that you can put in the slow bits, the tender bits, the fun bits. It doesn't have to be so radically compressed. So that is what I appreciate most about it. Plus, the inside baseball of it is that financing a movie depends entirely on the actor. You sign an actor, and that actor's status attracts the money, which limits you. If you've got a big budget movie, there's probably 12, certainly fewer than 20 actors in the world that could attract that money. Whereas television, the platform pays the money. The actor has zero responsibility for attracting investment. The platform pays for it up front, Amazon did, and then you can choose whoever you want for the actor. So that was tremendously liberating to be able to do that. And I remember, you know, when we started talking about it, casting, we all said, who are we going to get? And we all agreed we are going to get the biggest motherfucker.
Yes.
And the casting for it was right at the beginning of COVID. So we couldn't do it the normal way. The normal way you would do it is you go to Hollywood and you have a week hanging out at the Chateau Marmont or something, and being in the room with the actor. And we couldn't do that because it was COVID. Nobody was doing anything like that. So we did all the casting on Zoom, which I thought would be weird, but actually it was brilliant. It was fantastic because I suddenly realized that I would be judging on exactly the same thing the viewers would be judging. The guy on the screen, that's all I would see, and that's all anybody's ever going to see. So it was very consonant. It was just exactly right. And I had developed this crazy theory that I was going to judge the actor on the first 1 second. Before he said anything or did anything. I just wanted to see somebody step on the screen and own it and demand attention and just be Reacher. And Alan Ritchson did that. Within 1 second, I thought, yep, that's the guy. And then I thought, God, now I've got to have this ridiculous conversation with all the other producers in the studio and everything saying, I've judged it on 1 second. But they all agreed. You know, they were all doing that. It's about charisma. It's about the appearance. We can teach him how to do the lines and all that stuff. And he bulked up, you know, he worked out, he put on 30 or 40 pounds. And again, incredibly hard worker, works like crazy. So yeah, I'm really happy with the TV. Although I don't know, it's a cultural thing or just the way time has gone by, but whereas the feature films sold a lot of books as a result, the TV has hardly sold any extra books. It's like it's a completely separate audience. They see it on TV, they have no desire to read the book, which is took me slightly by surprise. But
Everybody already has your books. You've sold so many copies that there isn't anybody left to buy.
yeah, that is a reassuring thought. Somebody once emailed me an amateur porn picture. This not especially good-looking girl, completely naked, kneeling on the living room floor, totally amateur. And I thought, what? Why is somebody sending me this? Are they trying to get me in trouble? And then I looked again, and behind her was her bookshelf with a whole shelf of all my books.
Nice.
So yeah, people got them.
I think we probably should open it up for some questions if you have them. Yeah, why don't you just raise your hand? Yeah.
So now that would you consider writing another series that's not a future character, and would you also consider something like historical fiction?
Well, the question was, would I consider writing another series or maybe historical fiction or some other genre? And, the basic answer to that is you've got to remember one thing. I come from Europe. I have no work ethic. When I was starting elementary school, we did not have like the same system as here, where you have kindergarten and then grade 1 and so on. You just start. They call it primary school. And where I lived, the city where I lived, if you're born late in the year, you start young. So I started elementary school when I was 4, almost 5. And at that exact same time, my granddad was retiring. And from his job, he'd worked, his whole career doing something. He was 65 and retiring with a gold watch or whatever they got. And I did not know what that word meant. And I remember coming home from elementary school one afternoon, having been struggling with reading and arithmetic and all that stuff. I said to my mother, what does that mean, retiring? And she said, well, he's just going to stay at home now and do whatever he wants. And I thought, yeah, that sounds pretty good. So that became my ambition, lifelong ambition, to be retired. So I finally made it. So no, I'm not going to write any more series or not in another genre or something like that. My brother is now writing the Reacher book. I do have a secret plan, actually, that I'm going to write one secretly and give it to him and see if anybody notices. So that's a possibility, because that takes the time pressure off me. As long as I do it eventually, that would work. And I do. Having said that, I would never. I remember finishing my bestselling book and saying I'm never doing anything again. And since then, I've done loads of things. A lot of short stories here and there, and some like newspaper articles. And as part of this Amazon thing, I was so happy about the first season of Reacher, because Amazon they're very haughty, they're very pleased with themselves, they're very magisterial at everything. And I knew that season 1 was going to do well, because having observed it being made, it was solid, it was really good, it was going to do well. I knew that. But it did unbelievably well. I think it was released on Thursday, and 24 hours later, it had hit 2 billion streaming minutes. And Amazon completely blew their cool. That was Friday by this time, and on Saturday, on the weekend, they called to beg for season 2. Whereas I had imagined they would be all standoffish, wanting it, of course, but making us wait for a month or something like that. But the very next morning, they were doing it. And there was a lot of euphoria about it. And then season 2 came along and did even better than season 1, and the euphoria increased. And Amazon, Amazon has got 1,000 different divisions. And apparently they've got this thing called Amazon Original Stories. And so, completely belying what I said before about how you don't get paid for short stories, they made me an absurd offer. I mean, literally insane amount of money to write a short story. So I said, I'll tell you in 3 weeks. And then later on, they asked again, and I said, yeah, okay, I'll do it. So I've done a short story for Amazon, which is actually a bit like you're saying. It's about a sort of nerdy guy who's a mathematician at a no-name kind of Midwest college somewhere, and he gets involved in this thing. And so I've done that. I did a short story for. And what I found is I've totally changed my approach. Now I work on them quite hard because I also have this ridiculous OCD thing going on, whereby they'll tell you what word count they want. And I remember once the Daily Mail, which is an awful, horrible newspaper in Britain, they have a Christmas thing where they do a two-part story, Christmas week and then New Year's week. And they wanted me to do it, and I didn't want to do it. So my agent did what he always does, which is just ask for 4 times the money, which is usually something that then we can agree to disagree about, and everybody saves face. But they paid it. For this 2-part short story with a total word count of 5,000 words. So I massaged that story until part 1 was 2,500 words.
Oh my gosh.
Part 2 was 25,000. I just had to do that. And then I did the Spectator magazine, which again is a horrible magazine in Britain. It's a sort of awful conservative rag. But I happen to like the guy, the literary editor there. And so they wanted a short story for this past Christmas, a Christmas short story, which is a Reacher story. And they wanted 3,000 words. So that story is exactly 3,000 words. And it took me several days to do it.
Do we have another question? Yes, ma'am.
Well, since we're talking about Christmas and Reacher, I wonder, is Christmas Scorpion ever going to appear in a book?
Yeah, that was the Daily Mail
I
story.
love it,
Yeah.
and I've only been able to read the first section of it because I don't do online, so I was just curious.
That is, yeah, I don't know why that.
It's so good.
It's that's sort of, yeah, we could dig it out. Maybe we'll put
Yay.
that in volume 2.
Yeah.
Yay.
I don't know the story.
Part 2 is you can read it online.
No, you have to do it's like an ebook kind
Oh,
of thing. I read the first half online, but the
I
ebook.
saw another hand for the question. Yes, sir.
So back to Reacher. In creating Reacher, the conventional wisdom is you create a flawed hero. Whereas really, Sherlock Holmes, Jack Reacher, they're not flawed. They're just eccentric. Were you conscious of this when you created it?
Yeah, absolutely, totally conscious of it because you don't get to become a writer in any genre unless you've been a fan of that genre for decades. And I mean, I have been. I love crime fiction. I love thriller fiction. I've read it. I've been reading it all my life, almost literally. And I got really, really fed up of the migration towards dysfunctional, miserable characters. And it started out with, like everything in life, whoever introduces it is great because that's new, it's fresh, but then people copy it over and over and over and inflate it. And so you had James Lee Burke, let's say, with Dave Robichaud, which is a great character. I mean, and Burke is just such a great writer. That was a great, great concept, which I love. But he was a dysfunctional alcoholic cop, which was fine. It was good to read at that time. But then everybody piled in and copied it, so that the next guy is an alcoholic cop who's divorced and his wife hates him, and then the next guy does alcoholic cop who's divorced, whose wife and teenage daughter hate him. And then the next one is somebody who accidentally shot at a moving thing in the dark and it turned out to be a 12-year-old boy, so he goes and lives in a cabin in the woods and never speaks to anybody ever again. And I was just getting sick of these miserable guys. And I honestly believe that people don't want to read about miserable people. They would rather read about, sure, terrible predicaments, awful peril, all that kind of thing, but they want people to be basically decent. So what I wanted to do was kind of skip backward to a position that we were in maybe 80 or 100 years ago, where the character was essentially noble, because that is what powers a character like Reacher. He's an ancient trope, the knight errant. And to be a knight errant, you must have started out a knight. So I made him a West Point graduate, a major in the U.S. Army. And I made him basically good-hearted, but I think and that was a worry at the time. I thought, this guy, there's nothing wrong with him really. So how are people going to find him interesting? But the thing about Reacher is there's plenty wrong with him. It's just that he doesn't know it. He doesn't spend all his time gazing at his own navel, worrying about his situation. He thinks he's normal. And the rest of us know that he's not. So I felt that there was enough interest in him like that. But yeah, I agree. I think that the best heroes are relatively unflawed, because you got to remember what you're doing when you write a hero. What are you actually doing? You are giving a vehicle for other people to be in. You know, when somebody's reading a Reacher book, they are Reacher, and so you've got to you can't ask somebody, look, will you inhabit this character who's a total asshole? You can't do that. You've got to say, will you inhabit this character who's actually a pretty decent guy? And it works too. I just met a tiny little woman from the Philippines who said the only time she feels safe is when she's reading Reacher, because she is Reacher at that point.
That's great. One more question. Lindsay?
Hi, Otto. I'm curious, just based on what you just said. In the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, Sherlock Holmes is a fundamentally, I truly always believe, noble, decent guy. But you're not seeing it from his perspective. You're seeing it from John Watson's perspective, seeing all of these feats that he's accomplishing. And you're right, you are in Jack Reacher when you're in a Reacher novel. Does that make the reveals of the clues and the plotting and the narrative more difficult for you in a way to be in the head of the Sherlock Holmes of the series as opposed to being in the head of the John Watson?
Yeah, it really does. You know, and in passing, let's say that, let's just remember that amongst the general public, Sherlock Holmes is very much defined by film and television. Very few people have actually read the books. Same with James Bond. People remember the movies. They haven't far fewer have read the Ian Fleming. And Sherlock Holmes in the books is a pretty tough guy. You know, he's a great fighter. He does that Reacher thing in the books where if he's confronted with somebody, he maps it out in his head. He knows what he's doing. So, but it does make it harder to do the reveals. And but I don't think the Reacher books really depend that much on really tricky reveals. I think they depend on almost the opposite, which is that there's a situation which is pretty self-explanatory. There's this really bad guy, and here's Reacher, and the readers just cannot wait for the two to meet.
Yeah.
And they know what's going to happen. You know, there's no question that the bad guy will win. Reacher will obviously win, and people just want to see that happen. Because again, you know, the sophistication of fiction is that, why do we have fiction? We have it in order to get what we don't get in real life. And that is true of any genre. I used to live on 22nd Street, right by the Flatiron Building. And the subway was right outside the door. And there were 2 model agencies on that block. And so every single time I got on the subway, there would be 2 or 3 stunning women sitting opposite me. And I never once talked to them. I never once asked them to dinner. I never once asked them to fly down to the islands for a weekend. But in a book, of course you do. That is the purpose of a book. And so it's about giving people the joy of being Reacher without too much extraneous baggage, you know, like being an asshole or an alcoholic or this or that.
That's great. Lee, thank you very much for doing this.